Preface of The World Crisis, Volume 1. The World Crisis, Volume 1 by Winston Churchill. Preface. From October 25th, 1911 to May 28th, 1915, I was, in the words of the Royal Letters Patent and Orders in Council, responsible to Crown and Parliament for all the business of the Admiralty. This period comprised the final stage in the preparation against a war with Germany, the mobilization and concentration of the fleet before the outbreak, the organization of the blockade, the gathering in 1914 of the imperial forces from all over the world, the clearance from the oceans of all the German cruisers and commerce destroyers, the reinforcement of the fleet by new construction in 1914 and 1915, the frustration and defeat of the first German submarine attack upon merchant shipping in 1915, and the initiation of the enterprise against the Dardanelles. It was marked before the war by a complete revision of British naval war plans, by the building of a fast division of battleships armed with 15-inch guns and driven by oil fuel, by the proposals rejected by Germany for a naval holiday, and by the largest supplies till then ever voted by Parliament for the British fleet. It was distinguished during the war for the victories of the Heligoland Bight, of the Falkland Islands, and the Dogger Bank, and for the attempt to succor Antwerp. It was memorable for the disaster to the 3 cruisers off the Dutch coast, the loss of Admiral Craddock's squadron at Coronel, and the failure of the Navy to force the Dardanelles. Many accounts of these matters have been published both here and abroad. Most of the principal actors have unfolded their story. Lord Fisher, Lord Jellicoe, Lord French, Lord Kitchener's biographer, Lord Haig's staff, and many others of less importance have, with the utmost fullness and freedom, given their accounts of these and other wartime events and of the controversies arising out of them. The German accounts are numerous and authoritative. Admirals von Tirpitz and Scheer have told their tales. Sir Julian Corbett, the official historian, has in 1,000 pages recorded the conduct of the naval war during the whole of my administration. 8 years have passed since I quitted the Admiralty. In all these circumstances, I feel it both my right and my duty to set forth the manner in which I endeavor to discharge my share in these hazardous responsibilities. In doing so, I have adhered to certain strict rules. I have made no important statement of fact relating to naval operations or Admiralty business on which I do not possess unimpeachable documentary proof. I have made or implied no criticism of any decision or action taken or neglected by others, unless I can prove that I had expressed the same opinion in writing before the event. Many of the accounts which I have mentioned above enjoy the great advantage of having been written some considerable time after the events with which they deal, when the results of schemes and operations set on foot in the early days of the war could be clearly seen, and when the ideas and impressions of 1914 and 1915 could be reviewed in the broad and certain experience and science of 1918 and after. There are no doubt obvious conveniences in this way of treating the subject. Actors in these great situations are able to dwell with certainty upon those of their opinions and directions which have effectively been vindicated by the subsequent course of the war, and they are not, on the other hand, obliged to disturb the public mind by dwelling on any errors of neglect or commission into which they may possibly have been betrayed. I have followed a different method. In every case where the interests of the state allow, I have printed the actual memoranda, directions, minutes, telegrams, or letters written by me at the time, irrespective of whether these documents have been vindicated or falsified by the march of history and of time. The only excisions of relevant matter from the documents have been made to avoid needlessly hurting the feelings of individuals or the pride of friendly nations. For such reasons here and there sentences have been softened or suppressed, but the whole story is recorded as it happened, by the actual counsels offered and orders given in the fierce turmoil of each day. The principal minutes by which Admiralty business was conducted embody in every case decisions for which, as the highest executive authority in the department, I was directly responsible, and are in all cases expressed in my own words. I am equally accountable together with the First Sea Lord at the time, for the principal telegrams which moved fleets, squadrons, and individual ships, all of which, unless the contrary appears, bear my initials as their final sanction. The number of minutes and telegrams published in these volumes is, of course, only a fraction of the whole. Restricted space and the fear of wearying the reader have excluded much, but lest it should be thought that there have been any material suppressions, or that what is published does not truly represent what occurred, or the way things were done, I affirm my own willingness to see every document of Admiralty administration for which I am responsible made public, provided it is presented in its fair context. Sometimes a dozen or even a score of important decisions had to be taken in a single day. Complicated directions and recommendations were given, in writing as fast as they could be dictated, and were acted upon without recall thereafter. Nothing of any consequence was done by me by word of mouth. A complete record, therefore, exists both of executive and administrative action. If, in the great number of decisions and orders which these pages recount, and which deal with so many violent and controversial affairs, mistakes can be found which led to mishap, the fault is mine. If, on the other hand, favorable results were achieved, that should be counted to some extent as an offset. Where the decision lay outside of my powers and was taken contrary to my advice, I rest on the written record of my warning. Should it be objected that in any of these matters, many of them so highly technical, a landsman and layman could form no valuable opinion, I point to the documents themselves. They can be judged as they stand. But lest, on the other hand, it should be thought that I am seeking to claim credit which is not mine, it must be remembered that throughout this period I enjoyed the assistance, loyal, spontaneous, and unstinted, of the best brains of the Royal Navy, that every treasure of every branch of the Admiralty and the fleet was lavished upon my instruction, and that I had only to apply my own reason and instinct to the arguments of those who I believe stood in the foremost rank of the naval experts of the world. Taking a general view after years of the transactions of this terrific epoch, I commend with some confidence the story as a whole to the judgment of my countrymen. It has long been the fashion to disparage the policy and actions of the ministers who bore the burden of power in the fateful years before the war, and who faced the extraordinary perils of its outbreak and opening phases. Abroad, in allied, in neutral, and above all in enemy states, their work is regarded with respect and even admiration. At home, criticism has been its only meed. I hope that this account may be agreeable to those at least who wish to think well of our country, of its naval service, of its governing institutions, of its political life and public men, and that they will feel that perhaps after all Britain and her empire have not been so ill-guided through the great convulsions as is customary to declare. Lastly, I must record my thanks to Vice Admiral Thomas Jackson and others who have aided me in the preparation and revision of this work, especially in its technical aspect, and to those who have given me permission to quote correspondence or conversations in which they were concerned. Winston Churchill, London, January 1923. End of preface. Chapter 1 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, The Vials of Wrath, 1870 to 1904. Quote, to put on record what were their grounds of feud. Herodotus. The unending task, ruthless war, the Victorian age, national pride, national accountability, the Franco-German feud, Bismarck's apprehension, his precautions and alliances, the Bismarckian period and system, the young emperor and Caprivi, the Franco-Russian alliance, 1892, the balance of power, Anglo-German ties, Anglo-German estrangement, Germany and the South African War, the beginnings of the German Navy, the birth of a challenge, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the Russo-Japanese War, consequences, the Anglo-French Agreement of 1904, Lord Rosebery's comment, the Triple Entente, degeneration in Turkey and Austria, the long descent, the sinister hypothesis. It was the custom in the palmy days of Queen Victoria for statesmen to expatiate upon the glories of the British Empire and to rejoice in that protecting providence which had preserved us through so many dangers and brought us at length into a secure and prosperous age. Little did they know that the worst perils had still to be encountered and that the greatest triumphs were yet to be won. Children were taught of the Great War against Napoleon as the culminating effort in the history of the British peoples, and they looked on Waterloo and Trafalgar as the supreme achievements of British arms by land and sea. These prodigious victories, eclipsing all that had gone before, seemed the fit and predestined ending to the long drama of our island race, which had advanced over 1,000 years from small and weak beginnings to a foremost position in the world. 3 separate times in 3 different centuries had the British people rescued Europe from a military domination. Thrice had the Low Countries been assailed, by Spain, by the French monarchy, by the French Empire. Thrice had British war and policy, often maintained single-handed, overthrown the aggressor. Always at the outset the strength of the enemy had seemed overwhelming. Always the struggle had been prolonged through many years and across awful hazards. Always the victory had at last been won, and the last of all the victories had been the greatest of all, gained after the most ruinous struggle and over the most formidable foe. Surely that was the end of the tale, as it was so often the end of the book. History showed the rise, culmination, splendor, transition, and decline of states and empires. It seemed inconceivable that the same series of tremendous events through which since the days of Queen Elizabeth we had 3 times made our way successfully, should be repeated a 4th time, and on an immeasurably larger scale. Yet that is what has happened, and what we have lived to see. The Great War, through which we have passed, differed from all ancient wars in the immense power of the combatants and their fearful agencies of destruction, and from all modern wars in the utter ruthlessness with which it was fought. All the horrors of all the ages were brought together, and not only armies but whole populations were thrust into the midst of them. The mighty educated states involved conceived with reason that their very existence was at stake. Germany, having let hell loose, kept well in the van of terror, but she was followed step by the desperate and ultimately avenging nations she had assailed. Every outrage against humanity or international law was repaid by reprisals often on a greater scale and of longer duration. No truce or parley mitigated the strife of the armies. The wounded died between the lines, the dead moldered into the soil. Merchant ships and neutral ships and hospital ships were sunk on the seas, and all on board left to their fate or killed as they swam. Every effort was made to starve whole nations into submission without regard to age or sex. Cities and monuments were smashed by artillery. Bombs from the air were cast down indiscriminately. Poison gas in many forms stifled or seared the soldiers. Liquid fire was projected upon their bodies. Men fell from the air in flames, or were smothered, often slowly, in the dark recesses of the sea. The fighting strength of armies was limited only by the manhood of their countries. Europe and large parts of Asia and Africa became one vast battlefield on which, after years of struggle, not armies, but nations broke and ran. When all was over, torture and cannibalism were the only 2 expedients that the civilized, scientific Christian states had been able to deny themselves, and these were of doubtful utility. But nothing daunted the valiant heart of man. Son of the Stone Age, vanquisher of nature with all her trials and monsters, he met the awful and self-inflicted agony with new reserves of fortitude. Freed in the main by his intelligence from medieval fears, he marched to death with somber dignity. His nervous system was found in the 20th century capable of enduring physical and moral stresses before which the simpler natures of primeval times would have collapsed. Again and again, to the hideous bombardment, again and again from the hospital to the front, again and again to the hungry submarines, he strode unflinching, and withal, as an individual, preserved through these torments the glories of a reasonable and compassionate mind. In the beginning of the 20th century, men were everywhere unconscious of the rate at which the world was growing. It required the convulsion of the war to awaken the nations to the knowledge of their strengths. For a year after the war had begun, hardly anyone understood how terrific, how almost inexhaustible, were the resources in force, in substance, in virtue, behind every one of the combatants. The vials of wrath were full, but so were the reservoirs of power. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and still more after 1870, the accumulation of wealth and health by every civilized community had been practically unchecked. Here and there, a retarding episode had occurred. The waves had recoiled after advancing, but the mounting tide still flowed, and when the dread signal of Armageddon was made, mankind was found to be many times stronger in valor, in endurance, in brains, in science, in apparatus, in organization, not only than it had ever been before, but than even its most audacious optimist had dared to dream. The Victorian age was the age of accumulation, not of a mere piling up of material wealth, but of the growth and gathering in every land of all those elements and factors which go to make up the power of states. Education spread itself over the broad surface of the millions. Science had opened the limitless treasure house of nature. Door after door had been unlocked. One dim, mysterious gallery after another had been lighted up, explored, made free for all, and every gallery entered gave access to at least two more. Every morning when the world woke up, some new machinery had started running. Every night while the world had supper, it was running still. It ran on while all men slept. And the advance of the collective mind was at a similar pace. Disraeli said of the early years of the 19th century, "In those days England was for the few, and for the very few." Every year of Queen Victoria's reign saw those limits broken and extended. Every year brought in new thousands of people in private stations who thought about their own country and its story and its duties towards other countries, to the world and to the future, and understood the greatness of the responsibilities of which they were the heirs. Every year diffused a wider measure of material comfort among the higher ranks of labor. Substantial progress was made in mitigating the hard lot of the mass. Their health improved, their lives and the lives of their children were brightened, their stature grew, their securities against some of the gravest misfortunes were multiplied, their numbers greatly increased. Thus, when all the trumpets sounded, every class and rank had something to give to the need of the state. Some gave their science and some their wealth, some gave their business energy and drive, and some their wonderful personal prowess, and some their patient strength or patient weakness. But none gave more, or gave more readily, than the common man or woman who had nothing but a precarious week's wages between them and poverty, and owned little more than the slender equipment of a cottage and the garments in which they stood upright. Their love and pride of country, their loyalty to the symbols with which they were familiar, their keen sense of right and wrong as they saw it, led them to outface and endure perils and ordeals, the likes of which men had not known on earth. But these developments, these virtues, were no monopoly of any one nation. In every free country, great or small, the spirit of patriotism and nationality grew steadily, and in every country, bond or free, the organization and structure into which men were fitted by the laws gathered and armed this sentiment. Far more than their vices, the virtues of nations, ill-directed or misdirected by their rulers, became the cause of their own undoing and of the general catastrophe. And these rulers, in Germany, Austria, and Italy, in France, Russia, or Britain, how far were they to blame? Was there any man of real eminence and responsibility whose devil heart conceived and willed this awful thing? One rises from the study of the causes of the Great War with a prevailing sense of the defective control of individuals upon world fortunes. It has been well said, quote, "There is always more error than design in human affairs," end quote. The limited minds even of the ablest men, their disputed authority, the climate of opinion in which they dwell, their transient and partial contributions to the mighty problem, That problem itself so far beyond their compass, so vast in scale and detail, so changing in its aspect, all this must surely be considered before the complete condemnation of the vanquished or the complete acquittal of the victors can be pronounced. Events also got on to certain lines, and no one could get them off again. Germany clanked obstinately, recklessly, awkwardly towards the crater, and dragged us all in with her. But fierce resentment dwelt in France, and in Russia there were wheels within wheels. Could we in England, perhaps by some effort, by some sacrifice of our material interests, by some compulsive gesture, at once of friendship and command, have reconciled France and Germany in time and formed that grand association on which alone the peace and glory of Europe would be safe? I cannot tell. I only know that we tried our best to steer our country through the gathering dangers of the armed peace without bringing her to war or others to war, and when these efforts failed, we drove through the tempest without bringing her to destruction. There is no need here to trace the ancient causes of quarrel between the Germans and the French, to catalogue the conflicts with which they have scarred the centuries, nor to appraise the balance of injury or of provocation on one side or the other. When, on the 18th of January, 1871, the triumph of the Germans was consolidated by the proclamation of the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles, a new volume of European history was opened. Europe, it was said, quote, has lost a mistress and has gained a master. A new and mighty state had come into being, sustained by an overflowing population, equipped with science and learning, organized for war and crowned with victory. France, stripped of Alsace and Lorraine, beaten, impoverished, divided and alone, condemned to a decisive and increasing numerical inferiority, fell back to ponder in shade and isolation on her departed glories. But the chiefs of the German Empire were under no illusions as to the formidable character and implacable resolves of their prostrate antagonist. What we gained by arms in half a year, said Moltke, we must protect by arms for half a century if it is not to be torn from us again. Bismarck, more prudent still, would never have taken Lorraine. Forced by military pressure to assume the double burden against his better judgment, he exhibited from the outset in every act of his policy an extreme apprehension. Restrained by the opinion of the world and the decided attitude of Great Britain from striking down a reviving France in 1875, he devoted his whole power and genius to the construction of an elaborate system of alliances designed to secure the continued ascendancy of Germany and the maintenance of her conquests. He knew the quarrel with France was irreconcilable except at a price which Germany would never consent to pay. He understood that the abiding enmity of a terrific people would be fixed on his new-built empire. Everything else must be subordinated to that central fact. Germany could afford no other antagonisms. In 1879, he formed an alliance with Austria. 4 years later, this was expanded into the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria, and Italy. Romania was brought into this system by a secret alliance in 1883. Not only must there be insurance, there must be reinsurance. What he feared most was a counter-alliance between France and Russia, and none of these extending arrangements met this danger. His alliance with Austria, indeed, if left by itself, would naturally tend to draw France and Russia together. Could he not make a league of the three emperors, Germany, Austria, and Russia united? There at last was overwhelming strength and enduring safety. When in 1887, after 6 years, this supreme ideal of Bismarck was ruptured by the clash of Russian and Austrian interests in the Balkans, he turned, as the best means still open to him, to his reinsurance treaty with Russia. Germany, by this arrangement, secured herself against becoming the object of an aggressive combination by France and Russia. Russia, on the other hand, was reassured that the Austro-German alliance would not be used to undermine her position in the Balkans. All these cautious and sapient measures were designed with the object of enabling Germany to enjoy her victory in peace. The Bismarckian system, further, always included the principle of good relations with Great Britain. This was necessary, for it was well known that Italy would never willingly commit herself to anything that would bring her into war with Great Britain, and had, as the world now knows, required this fact to be specifically stated in the original and secret text of the Triple Alliance. To this alliance, in its early years, Great Britain had been wholly favorable. Thus, France was left to nurse her scars alone, and Germany, assured in her predominance on the continent, was able to take the fullest advantage of the immense industrial developments which characterized the close of the 19th century. The policy of Germany further encouraged France as a consolation to develop her colonial possessions in order to take her thoughts off Europe and incidentally to promote a convenient rivalry and friction with Great Britain. This arrangement, under which Europe lived rigidly but peacefully for 20 years and Germany waxed in power and splendor, was ended in 1890 with the fall of Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor was gone, and new forces began to assail the system he had maintained with consummate ability so long. There was a constant danger of conflagration in the Balkans and in the Near East through Turkish misgovernment. The rising tides of pan-Slavism and the strong anti-German currents in Russia began to wash against the structure of the reinsurance treaty. Lastly, German ambitions grew with German prosperity. Not content with the hegemony of Europe, she sought a colonial domain. Already the greatest of military empires, she began increasingly to turn her thoughts to the sea. The young emperor, freed from Bismarck and finding in Count Caprivi and the lesser men who succeeded him complacent coadjutors, began gaily to dispense with the safeguards and precautions by which the safety of Germany had been buttressed. While the quarrel with France remained open and undying, the reinsurance treaty with Russia was dropped, and later on the naval rivalry with Britain was begun. These two somber decisions rolled forward slowly as the years unfolded. Their consequences became apparent in due season. In 1892, the event against which the whole policy of Bismarck had been directed came to pass. The dual alliance was signed between Russia and France. Although the effects were not immediately visible, the European situation was in fact transformed. Henceforward, for the undisputed but soberly exercised predominance of Germany, there was substituted a balance of power. Two vast combinations, each disposing of enormous military resources, dwelt together, at first side by side, but gradually face to face. Although the groupings of the great powers had thus been altered sensibly to the disadvantage of Germany, there was in this alteration nothing that threatened her with war. The abiding spirit of France had never abandoned the dream of recovering the lost provinces, but the prevailing temper of the French nation was pacific, and all classes remained under the impression of the might of Germany and of the terrible consequences likely to result from war. Moreover, the French were never sure of Russia in a purely Franco-German quarrel. True, there was the treaty, but the treaty to become operative required aggression on the part of Germany. What constitutes aggression? At what point in a dispute between two heavily armed parties does one side or the other become the aggressor? At any rate, there was a wide field for discretionary action on the part of Russia. Of all these matters, she would be the judge, and she would be the judge at a moment when it might be said that the Russian people would be sent to die in millions over a quarrel between France and Germany, in which they had no direct interest. The word of the Tsar was indeed a great assurance, but Tsars who tried to lead their nations, however honorably, into unpopular wars might disappear. The policy of a great people, if hung too directly upon the person of a single individual, was liable to be changed by his disappearance. France, therefore, could never feel certain that if on any occasion she resisted German pressure and war resulted, Russia would march. Such was the ponderous balance which had succeeded the unquestioned ascendancy of Germany. Outside both systems rested England, secure in an overwhelming and as yet unchallenged naval supremacy. It was evident that the position of the British Empire received added importance from the fact that adhesion to either alliance would decide the predominance of strength. But Lord Salisbury showed no wish to exploit this favorable situation. He maintained steadily the traditional friendly attitude towards Germany, combined with a cool detachment from continental entanglements. It had been easy for Germany to lose touch with Russia, but the alienation of England was a far longer process. So many props and ties had successively to be demolished. British suspicions of Russia in Asia, the historic antagonism to France, memories of Blenheim, of Minden, and of Waterloo, the continued disputes with France in Egypt and the colonial sphere, their intimate business connections between Germany and England, the relationship of the royal families, all these constituted a profound association between the British Empire and the leading state in that Triple Alliance. It was no part of British policy to obstruct the newborn colonial aspirations of Germany, and in more than one instance, as at Samoa, we actively assisted them. With a complete detachment from strategic considerations, Lord Salisbury exchanged Heligoland for Zanzibar. Still, even before the fall of Bismarck, the Germans did not seem pleasant diplomatic comrades. They appeared always to be seeking to enlist our aid and reminding us that they were our only friend. To emphasize this, they went even further. They sought in minor ways to embroil us with France and Russia. Each year, the Wilhelmstrasse looked inquiringly to the court of St. James for some new service or concession which should keep Germany's diplomatic goodwill alive for a further period. Each year they made mischief for us with France and Russia, and pointed the moral of how unpopular Great Britain was, what powerful enemies she had, and how lucky she was to find a friend in Germany. Where would she be in the councils of Europe if German assistance were withdrawn, or if Germany threw her influence into the opposing combination? These manifestations, prolonged for nearly 20 years, produced very definite sensations of estrangement in the minds of the rising generation at the British Foreign Office. But none of these woes of diplomatists deflected the steady course of British policy. The colonial expansion of Germany was viewed with easy indifference by the British Empire. In spite of their rivalry in trade, there grew up a far more important commercial connection between Britain and Germany. In Europe, we were each other's best customers. Even the German Emperor's telegram to President Kruger on the Jameson raid in 1896, which we now know to have been no personal act but a decision of the German government, produced only a temporary ebullition of anger. All the German outbursts of rage against England during the Boer War, and such attempts as were made to form a European coalition against us, did not prevent Mr. Chamberlain in 1901 from advocating an alliance with Germany, or the British Foreign Office from proposing in the same year to make the alliance between Britain and Japan into a triple alliance including Germany. During this period, we had at least as serious differences with France as with Germany, and sufficient naval superiority not to be seriously disquieted by either. We stood equally clear of the triple and of the dual alliance. We had no intention of being drawn into a continental quarrel. No effort by France to regain her lost provinces appealed to the British public or to any political party. The idea of a British army fighting in Europe amid the mighty hosts of the continent was by all dismissed as utterly absurd. Only a menace to the very life of the British nation would stir the British Empire from its placid and tolerant detachment from continental affairs. But that menace Germany was destined to supply. Among the great powers, said Moltke in his military testament, England necessarily requires a strong ally on the continent. She would not find one which corresponds better to all her interests than a united Germany that can never make claim to the command of the sea. From 1873 to 1900, the German Navy was avowedly not intended to provide for the possibility of, quote, a naval war against great naval powers. Now, in 1900, came a fleet law of a very different kind. Quote, for the protection of trade and the colonies, declared the preamble of this document, there is only one thing that will suffice, namely, a strong battle fleet. In order to protect German trade and commerce under existing conditions, only one thing will suffice, namely, Germany must possess a battle fleet of such a strength that, even for the most powerful naval adversary, a war would involve such risks as to make that power's own supremacy doubtful. For this purpose, it is not absolutely necessary that the German fleet should be as strong as that of the greatest naval power, for, as a rule, a great naval power will not be in a position to concentrate all its forces against us. Even if it were successful in bringing against us a much superior force, the defeat of a strong German fleet would so considerably weaken the enemy that in spite of the victory that might be achieved, his own supremacy would no longer be assured by a fleet of sufficient strength. For the attainment of this object, viz., protection of our trade and colonies by assuring peace with honor, Germany requires, according to the strength of the great naval powers and with regard to our tactical formations, 2 double squadrons of first-class battleships, with the necessary attendant cruisers, torpedo boats, etc. Since the fleet law provides for only 2 squadrons, the construction of 3rd and 4th squadrons is proposed. 2 of these 4 squadrons will form one fleet. The tactical formation of the 2nd fleet should be similar to that of the 1st as provided for in the fleet law. And again, in addition to the increase of the home fleet, an increase of the foreign service ships is also necessary. In order to estimate the importance of an increase in our foreign service ships, it must be realized that they represent the German Navy abroad, and that to them often falls the task of gathering fruits which have ripened as a result of the naval strength of the empire embodied in the home battle fleet. And again, if the necessity for so strong a fleet for Germany be recognized, it cannot be denied that the honor and welfare of the fatherland authoritatively demand that the home fleet be brought up to the requisite strength as soon as possible. The determination of the greatest military power on the continent to become at the same time at least the 2nd naval power was an event of first magnitude in world affairs. It would, if carried into full effect, undoubtedly reproduce those situations which at previous periods in history had proved of such awful significance to the islanders of Britain. Hitherto, all British naval arrangements had proceeded on the basis of the 2-power standard, namely, an adequate superiority over the next 2 strongest powers, in those days France and Russia. The possible addition of a 3rd European fleet more powerful than either of these 2 would profoundly affect the life of Britain. If Germany was going to create a navy avowedly measured against our own, we could not afford to remain, quote, in splendid isolation from the European systems. We must, in these circumstances, find a trustworthy friend. We found one in another island empire situated on the other side of the globe and also in danger. In 1901, the alliance was signed between Great Britain and Japan. Still less could we afford to have dangerous causes of quarrel open both with France and Russia. In 1902, the British government, under Mr. Balfour and Lord Lansdowne, definitely embarked upon the policy of settling up our differences with France. Still, before either of these steps were taken, the hand was held out to Germany. She was invited to join with us in the alliance with Japan. She was invited to make a joint effort to solve the Moroccan problem. Both offers were declined. In 1904, the war between Russia and Japan broke out. Germany sympathized mainly with Russia. England stood ready to fulfill her treaty engagements with Japan, while at the same time cultivating good relations with France. In this posture, the powers awaited the results of the Far Eastern struggle. It brought a surprise to all but one: the military and naval overthrow of Russia by Japan and the internal convulsions of the Russian state produced profound changes in the European situation. Although German influence had leaned against Japan, she felt herself enormously strengthened by the Russian collapse. Her continental predominance was restored. Her self-assertion in every sphere became sensibly and immediately pronounced. France, on the other hand, weakened and once again, for the time being, isolated and in real danger, became increasingly anxious for an entente with England. England, whose statesmen with penetrating eye alone in Europe had truly measured the martial power of Japan, gained remarkably in strength and security. Japan, her new ally, was triumphant. France, her ancient enemy, sought her friendship. The German fleet was still only a building, and meanwhile all the British battleships in China seas could now be safely brought home. The settlement of outstanding differences between England and France proceeded, and at last in 1904, the Anglo-French agreement was signed. There were various clauses, but the essence of the compact was that the French desisted from opposition to British interests in Egypt, and Britain gave a general support to the French views about Morocco. This agreement was acclaimed by the conservative forces in England, among whom the idea of the German menace had already taken root. It was also hailed somewhat short-sightedly by liberal statesmen as a step to secure general peace by clearing away misunderstandings and differences with our traditional enemy. It was therefore almost universally welcomed. Only one profound observer raised his voice against it. Quote, "My mournful and supreme conviction," said Lord Rosebery, "is that this agreement is much more likely to lead to complications than to peace." End quote. This unwelcome comment was indignantly spurned from widely different standpoints by both British parties, and general censure fell upon its author. Still, England and all that she stood for had left her isolation and had reappeared in Europe on the opposite side to Germany. For the first time since 1870, Germany had to take into consideration a power outside her system which was in no way amenable to threats and was not unable, if need be, to encounter her single-handed. The gesture, which was to sweep Delcasse from power in 1905, the apparition in shining armor, which was to quell Russia in 1908, could procure no such compliance from the independent island girt with her fleet and mistress of the seas. Up to this moment, the Triple Alliance had on the whole been stronger than France and Russia. Although war against these two powers would have been a formidable undertaking for Germany, Austria, and Italy, its ultimate issue did not seem doubtful. But if the weight of Britain were thrown into the adverse scale, and that of Italy withdrawn from the other, then for the first time since 1870, Germany could not feel certain that she was on the stronger side. Would she submit to it? Would the growing, bounding ambitions and assertions of the new German Empire consent to a situation in which, very politely no doubt, very gradually perhaps, but still very surely, the impression would be conveyed that her will was no longer the final law of Europe? If Germany and her emperor would accept the same sort of restraint that France, Russia, and England had long been accustomed to, and would live within her rights as an equal in a freer and easier world, all would be well. But would she? Would she tolerate the gathering under an independent standard of nations outside her system, strong enough to examine her claims only as the merits appealed to them, and to resist aggression without fear? The history of the next 10 years was to supply the answer. Side by side with these slowly marshaling and steadily arming antagonisms between the greatest powers, processes of degeneration were at work in weaker empires almost equally dangerous to peace. Forces were alive in Turkey, which threatened with destruction the old regime and its abuses on which Germany had chosen to lean. The Christian states of the Balkans, growing stronger year by year, awaited an opportunity to liberate their compatriots still writhing under Turkish misrule. The growth of national sentiment in every country created fierce strains and stresses in the uneasily knit and crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Balkan states saw also in this direction kinsmen to rescue, territory to recover, and unities to achieve. Italy watched with ardent eyes the decay of Turkey and the unrest of Austria. It was certain that from all these regions of the south and of the east, there would come a succession of events deeply agitating both to Russia and to Germany. To create the unfavorable conditions for herself in which Germany afterwards brought about the war, many acts of supreme unwisdom on the part of her rulers were nevertheless still necessary. France must be kept in a state of continued apprehension. The Russian nation, not the Russian court alone, must be stung by some violent affront inflicted in their hour of weakness. The slow, deep, restrained antagonism of the British Empire must be roused by the continuous and repeated challenge to the sea power by which it lived. Then, and then only, could those conditions be created under which Germany by an act of aggression would bring into being against her a combination strong enough to resist and ultimately overcome her might. There was still a long road to travel before the vials of wrath were full. For 10 years we were to journey anxiously along that road. It was for a time the fashion to write as if the British government during these 10 years were either entirely unconscious of the approaching danger or had a load of secret matters and deep forebodings on their minds hidden altogether from the thoughtless nation. In fact, however, neither of these alternatives, taken separately, was true, and there is a measure of truth in both of them taken together. British government and the parliaments out of which it sprang did not believe in the approach of a great war and were determined to prevent it. But at the same time, the sinister hypothesis was continually present in their thoughts and was repeatedly brought to the attention of ministers by disquieting incidents and tendencies. During the whole of those 10 years, this duality and discordance were the keynote of British politics, and those whose duty it was to watch over the safety of the country lived simultaneously in two different worlds of thought. There was the actual visible world with its peaceful activities and cosmopolitan aims, and there was a hypothetical world, a world, quote, beneath the threshold, as it were, a world at one moment utterly fantastic, at the next seeming about to leap into reality, a world of monstrous shadows, moving in convulsive combinations through vistas of fathomless catastrophe. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill. Milestones to Armageddon, 1905 to 1910. Quote, enmities which are unspoken and hidden are more to be feared than those which are outspoken and open. End quote. Cicero. A narrower stage, the Victorian calm, the chain of strife, Lord Salisbury retires, Mr. Balfour and the end of an epoch, fall of the Conservative government, the general election of 1906, the Algeciras Conference, Anglo-French military conversations, Mr. Asquith's administration, the Austrian annexations, the German threat to Russia, the Admiralty Program of 1909, the growth of the German Navy, German finance and its implications, the inheritance of the new German Chancellor. If the reader is to understand this tale and the point of view from which it is told, he should follow the author's mind in each principal sphere of causation. He must not only be acquainted with the military and naval situations as they existed at the outbreak of war, but with the events which led up to them. He must be introduced to the admirals and to the generals. He must study the organization of the fleets and armies and the outlines of their strategy by sea and land. He must not shrink even from the design of ships and cannon. He must extend his view to the groupings and slow-growing antagonisms of modern states. He must contract it to the humbler but unavoidable warfare of parties and the interplay of political forces and personalities. The dramatis personae of the previous chapter have been great states and empires, and its theme their worldwide balance and combinations. Now, the stage must for a while be narrowed to the limits of these islands and occupied by the political personages and factions of the time and of the hour. In the year 1895, I had the privilege, as a young officer, of being invited to lunch with Sir William Harcourt. In the course of a conversation in which I took, I fear, none too modest a share, I asked the question, "What will happen then?" "My dear Winston," replied the old Victorian statesman, "the experiences of a long life have convinced me that nothing ever happens." Since that moment, as it seems to me, nothing has ever ceased happening. The growth of the great antagonisms abroad was accompanied by the progressive aggravation of party strife at home. The scale on which events have shaped themselves has dwarfed the episodes of the Victorian era. Its small wars between great nations, its earnest disputes about superficial issues, the high, keen intellectualism of its personages, the sober, frugal, narrow limitations of their action, belong to a vanished period. The smooth river with its eddies and ripples along which we then sailed seems inconceivably remote from the cataract down which we have been hurled and the rapids in whose turbulence we are now struggling. I date the beginning of these violent times in our country from the Jameson raid in 1896. This was the herald, if not indeed the progenitor, of the South African War. From the South African War was born the khaki election, the protectionist movement, the Chinese labor cry, and the consequent furious reaction and liberal triumph of 1906. From this sprang the violent inroads of the House of Lords upon popular government, which by the end of 1908 had reduced the immense liberal majority to virtual impotence, from which condition they were rescued by the Lloyd George budget in 1909. This measure became, in its turn, on both sides, the cause of still greater provocations, and its rejection by the Lords was a constitutional outrage and political blunder almost beyond compare. It led directly to the two general elections of 1910, to the Parliament Act, and to the Irish struggle, in which our country was brought to the very threshold of civil war. Thus, we see a succession of partisan actions continuing without intermission for nearly 20 years, each injury repeated with interest, each oscillation more violent, each risk more grave, until at last it seemed that the saber itself must be invoked to cool the blood and the passions that were rife. In July 1902, Lord Salisbury retired. With what seems now to have been only a brief interlude, he had been Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary since 1885. In those 17 years, the Liberal Party had never exercised any effective control upon affairs. Their brief spell in office had only been obtained by a majority of 40 Irish nationalist votes. During 13 years, the Conservatives had enjoyed homogeneous majorities of 100 to 150, and in addition, there was the House of Lords. This long reign of power had now come to an end. The desire for change, the feelings that change was impending, was widespread. It was the end of an epoch. Lord Salisbury was followed by Mr. Balfour. The new Prime Minister never had a fair chance. He succeeded only to an exhausted inheritance. Indeed, his wisest course would have been to get out of office as decently, as quietly, and above all, as quickly as possible. He could, with great propriety, have declared that the 1900 Parliament had been elected on war conditions and on a war issue, that the war was now finished successfully, that the mandate was exhausted, and that he must recur to the sense of the electors before proceeding farther with his task. No doubt, the Liberals would have come into power, but not by a large majority, and they would have been faced by a strong, united Conservative opposition, which in 4 or 5 years, about 1907, would have resumed effective control of the state. The solid ranks of Conservative members who acclaimed Mr. Balfour's accession as First Minister were, however, in no mood to be dismissed to their constituencies when the Parliament was only 2 years old and had still 4 or 5 years more to run. Mr. Balfour therefore addressed himself to the duties of government with a serene indifference to the vast alienation of public opinion and consolidation of hostile forces which were proceeding all around him. Mr. Chamberlain, his almost all-powerful lieutenant, was under no illusions. He felt, with an acute political sensitiveness, the ever-growing strength of the tide setting against the ruling combination. But instead of pursuing courses of moderation and prudence, he was impelled by the ardor of his nature to a desperate remedy. The government was reproached with being reactionary. The moderate Conservatives and the younger Conservatives were all urging liberal and conciliatory processes. The opposition was advancing hopefully towards power, heralded by a storm of angry outcry. He would show them, and show doubting or weary friends as well, how it was possible to quell indignation by violence, and from the very heart of reaction to draw the means of popular victory. He unfurled the flag of protection. Time, adversity, and the recent Education Act had united the Liberals. Protection, or tariff reform as it was called, split the Conservatives. Ultimately, 6 ministers resigned, and 50 conservative or unionist members definitely withdrew their support from the government. Among them were a number of those younger men from whom a party should derive new force and driving power, and who are specially necessary to it during a period of opposition. The action of the Free Trade Unionists was endorsed indirectly by Lord Salisbury himself from his retirement, and was actively sustained by such pillars of the Unionist party as Sir Michael Hicks Beach and the Duke of Devonshire. No such formidable loss had been sustained by the Conservative party since the expulsion of the Peelites. But if Mr. Balfour had not felt inclined to begin his reign by an act of abdication, he was still less disposed to have power wrested from his grasp. Moreover, he regarded a party split as the worst of domestic catastrophes, and responsibility for it as the unforgivable sin. He therefore labored with amazing patience and coolness to preserve a semblance of unity, to calm the tempest, and to hold on as long as possible in the hope of its subsiding. With the highest subtlety and ingenuity, he devised a succession of formulas designed to enable people who differed profoundly to persuade themselves they were in agreement. When it came to the resignation of ministers, he was careful to shed free trade and protectionist blood as far as possible in equal quantities. Like Henry VIII, he decapitated papists and burned hot gospelers on the same day for the respective divergencies in opposite directions from his central, personal, and artificial compromise. In this unpleasant situation, Mr. Balfour maintained himself for 2 whole years. Vain the clamor for a general election, vain the taunts of clinging to office, vain the solicitations of friends and the attempts of foes to force a crucial issue. The Prime Minister remained immovable, inexhaustible, imperturbable, and he remained Prime Minister. His clear, just mind, detached from small things, stood indifferent to the clamor about him. He pursued, as has been related, through the critical period of the Russo-Japanese War, a policy in support of Japan of the utmost firmness. He resisted all temptations, on the other hand, to make the sinking of our trawlers on the Dogger's Bank by the Russian fleet an occasion of war with Russia. He formed the Committee of Imperial Defense, the instrument of our preparedness. He carried through the agreement with France of 1904, the momentous significance of which the last chapter has explained. But in 1905, political Britain cared for none of these things. The credit of the government fell steadily. The process of degeneration in the Conservative Party was continuous. The storm of opposition grew unceasingly, and so did the unification of all the forces opposed to the dying regime. Late in November 1905, Mr. Balfour tendered his resignation as Prime Minister to the King. The government of Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman was formed, and proceeded in January to appeal to the constituencies. This government represented both the wings into which the Liberal party had been divided by the Boer War. The Liberal imperialists, so distinguished by their talents, filled some of the greatest offices. Mr. Asquith went to the Exchequer, Sir Edward Grey to the Foreign Office, Mr. Haldane became Secretary of State for War. On the other hand, the Prime Minister, who himself represented the mainstream of Liberal opinion, appointed Sir Robert Reid, Lord Chancellor, and Mr. John Morley, Secretary of State for India. Both these statesmen, while not opposing actual war measures in South Africa, had unceasingly condemned the war, and in Mr. Lloyd George and Mr. John Burns, both of whom entered the cabinet, were found democratic politicians who had gone even further. The dignity of the administration was enhanced by the venerable figures of Lord Ripon, Sir Henry Fowler, and the newly returned Viceroy of India, Lord Elgin. The result of the polls in January 1906 was a Liberal landslide. Never since the election following the Great Reform Bill had anything comparable occurred in British parliamentary history. In Manchester, for instance, which was one of the principal battlegrounds, Mr. Balfour and 8 Conservative colleagues were dismissed and replaced by 9 Liberals or Labour men. Conservatives, after nearly 20 years of power, crept back to the House of Commons barely 150 strong. The Liberals had gained a majority of more than 100 over all other parties combined. Both great parties harbored deep grievances against the other, and against the wrong of the khaki election and its misuse was set the counterclaim of an unfair Chinese labor cry. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman was still receiving the resounding acclamations of liberals, peace lovers, anti-jingoes, and anti-militarists in every part of the country when he was summoned by Sir Edward Grey to attend to business of a very different character. The Algeciras Conference was in its throes. When the Anglo-French agreement on Egypt and Morocco had first been made known, the German government accepted the situation without protest or complaint. The German Chancellor, Prince Bülow, had even declared in 1904 that there was nothing in the agreement to which Germany could take exception. Quote, "What appears to be before us is the attempt by the method of friendly understanding to eliminate a number of points of difference which exist between England and France. We have no objection to make against this from the standpoint of German interest." End quote. A serious agitation most embarrassing to the German government was, however, set on foot by the pan-German and colonial parties. Under this pressure, the attitude of the government changed, and a year later, Germany openly challenged the agreement and looked about for an opportunity to assert her claims in Morocco. This opportunity was not long delayed. Early in 1905, a French mission arrived in Fez. Their language and actions seemed to show an intention of treating Morocco as a French protectorate, thereby ignoring the international obligations of the Treaty of Madrid. The Sultan of Morocco appealed to Germany, asking if France was authorized to speak in the name of Europe. Germany was now enabled to advance as the champion of an international agreement which she suggested France was violating. Behind this lay the clear intention to show France that she could not afford, in consequence of her agreement with Britain, to offend Germany. The action taken was of the most drastic character. The German emperor was persuaded to go to Tangiers, and there, against his better judgment, on March 31st, 1905, he delivered, in very uncompromising language chosen by his ministers, an open challenge to France. To this speech, the widest circulation was given by the German Foreign Office. Hot foot upon it, April 11th and 12th, two very threatening dispatches were sent to Paris and London, demanding a conference of all the signatory powers to the Treaty of Madrid. Every means was used by Germany to make France understand that if she refused the conference, there would be war. And to make assurance doubly sure, a special envoy was sent from Berlin to Paris for that express purpose. France was quite unprepared for war. The army was in a bad state. Russia was incapacitated. Moreover, France had not a good case. The French foreign minister, M. Delcasse, was, however, unwilling to give way. The German attitude became still more threatening, and on June 6th, the French cabinet of M. Rouvier unanimously, almost at the cannon's mouth, accepted the principle of a conference, and M. Delcasse at once resigned. So far, Germany had been very successful. Under a direct threat of war, she had compelled France to bow to her will and to sacrifice the minister who had negotiated the agreement with Great Britain. The Rouvier cabinet sought earnestly for some friendly solution which, while sparing France the humiliation of a conference dictated in such circumstances, would secure substantial concessions to Germany. The German government were, however, determined to exploit their victory to the full and not to make the situation easier for France either before or during the conference. The conference accordingly assembled at Algeciras in January 1906. Great Britain now appeared on the scene, apparently quite unchanged and unperturbed by her domestic convulsions. She had in no way encouraged France to refuse the conference. But if a war was to be fastened on France by Germany as the direct result of an agreement made recently in the full light of day between France and Great Britain, it was held that Great Britain could not remain indifferent. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman therefore authorized Sir Edward Grey to support France strongly at Algeciras. He also authorized, almost as the first act of what was to be an era of peace, retrenchment, and reform, the beginning of military conversations between the British and French general staffs, with a view to concerted action in the event of war. This was a step of profound significance and of far-reaching reactions. Henceforward, the relations of the two staffs became increasingly intimate and confidential. The minds of our military men were definitely turned into a particular channel. Mutual trust grew continually in one set of military relationships, mutual precautions in the other. However explicitly the two governments might agree and affirm to each other that no national or political engagement was involved in these technical discussions, the fact remained that they constituted an exceedingly potent tie. The attitude of Great Britain at Algeciras turned the scale against Germany. Russia, Spain, and other signatory powers associated themselves with France and England. Austria revealed to Germany the limits beyond which she would not go. Thus, Germany found herself isolated, and what she had gained by her threats of war evaporated at the council board. In the end, a compromise suggested by Austria enabled Germany to withdraw without open loss of dignity. From these events, however, serious consequences flowed. Both the two systems into which Europe was divided were crystallized and consolidated. Germany felt the need of binding Austria more closely to her. Her open attempt to terrorize France had produced a deep impression upon French public opinion. An immediate and thorough reform of the French army was carried out, and the entente with England was strengthened and confirmed. Algeciras was a milestone on the road to Armageddon. The illness and death of Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman at the beginning of 1908 opened the way for Mr. Asquith. The Chancellor of the Exchequer had been the first lieutenant of the late Prime Minister, and, as his chief's strength failed, had more and more assumed the burden. He had charged himself with the conduct of the new licensing bill, which was to be the staple of the session of 1908, and in virtue of this task, he could command the allegiance of an extreme and doctrinaire section of his party from whom his imperialism had previously alienated him. He resolved to ally to himself the democratic gifts and rising reputation of Mr. Lloyd George. Thus the succession passed smoothly from hand to hand. Mr. Asquith became Prime Minister. Mr. Lloyd George became Chancellor of the Exchequer and the second man in the government. The new cabinet, like the old, was a veiled coalition. A very distinct line of cleavage was maintained between the radical pacifist elements who had followed Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman and constituted the bulk both of the cabinet and the party on the one hand, and the liberal imperialist wing on the other. Mr. Asquith, as Prime Minister, had now to take an impartial position, but his heart and sympathies were always with Sir Edward Grey, the War Office, and the Admiralty, and on every important occasion when he was forced to reveal himself, he definitely sided with them. He was not, however, able to give Sir Edward Grey the same effectual countenance, much as he might wish to do so, that Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman had done. The old chief's word was law to the extremists of his party. They would accept almost anything from him. They were quite sure he would do nothing more in matters of foreign policy and defense than was absolutely necessary, and that he would do it in the manner least calculated to give satisfaction to Jingo's sentiments. Mr. Asquith, however, had been far from sound about the Boer War, and was the lifelong friend of the Foreign Secretary, who had wandered even further from the straight path into patriotic pastures. He was therefore in a certain sense suspect, and every step he took in external affairs was watched with prim vigilance by the elders. If the military conversations with France had not been authorized by Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, and if his political virtue could not be cited in their justification, I doubt whether they could have been begun or continued by Mr. Asquith. Since I had crossed the floor of the House in 1904 on the free trade issue, I had worked in close political association with Mr. Lloyd George. He was the first to welcome me. We sat and acted together in the period of opposition preceding Mr. Balfour's fall, and we had been in close accord during Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman's administration, in which I had served as Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies. This association continued when I entered the new cabinet as President of the Board of Trade, and in general, though from different angles, we leaned to the side of those who would restrain the froward both in foreign policy and in armaments. It must be understood that these differences of attitude and complexion, which in varying forms reproduced themselves in every great and powerful British administration, in no way prevented harmonious and agreeable relations between the principal personages, and our affairs proceeded amid many amenities in an atmosphere of courtesy, friendliness, and goodwill. It was not long before the next European crisis arrived. On October 5, 1908, Austria, without warning or parley, proclaimed the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. These provinces of the Turkish Empire had been administered by her under the Treaty of Berlin, 1878, and the annexation only declared in form what already existed in fact. The Young Turk Revolution, which had occurred in the summer, seemed to Austria likely to lead to a reassertion of Turkish sovereignty over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this she was concerned to forestall. A reasonable and patient diplomacy would probably have secured for Austria the easements which she needed. Indeed, negotiations with Russia, the great power most interested, had made favorable progress. But suddenly and abruptly, Count Aehrenthal, the Austrian foreign minister, interrupted the discussions by the announcement of the annexation before the arrangements for a suitable concession to Russia had been concluded. By this essentially violent act, a public affront was put upon Russia and a personal slight upon the Russian negotiator, M. Izvolsky. A storm of anger and protest arose on all sides. England, basing herself on the words of the London Conference in 1871, quote, that it is an essential principle of the law of nations that no power can free itself from the engagements of a treaty, nor modify its stipulations except by consent of the contracting parties, end quote, refused to recognize either the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina or the declaration of Bulgarian independence which had synchronized with it. Turkey protested loudly against a lawless act. An effective boycott of Austrian merchandise was organized by the Turkish government. The Serbians mobilized their army, but it was the effect on Russia which was the most serious. The bitter animosity excited against Austria throughout Russia became a penultimate cause of the Great War. In this national quarrel, the personal differences of Aehrenthal and Izvolsky played also their part. Great Britain and Russia now demanded a conference, declining meanwhile to countenance what had been done. Austria, supported by Germany, refused. The danger of some violent action on the part of Serbia became acute. Sir Edward Grey, after making it clear that Great Britain would not be drawn into a war on a Balkan quarrel, labored to restrain Serbia, to pacify Turkey, and to give full diplomatic support to Russia. The controversy dragged on till April 1909, when it was ended in the following remarkable manner. The Austrians had determined, unless Serbia recognized the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to send an ultimatum and to declare war upon her. At this point, the German Chancellor, Prince von Bülow, intervened. Russia, he insisted, should herself advise Serbia to give way. The powers should officially recognize the annexation without a conference being summoned and without any kind of compensation to Serbia. Russia was to give her consent to this action without previously informing the British or French governments. If Russia did not consent, Austria would declare war on Serbia with the full and complete support of Germany. Russia, thus nakedly confronted by war both with Austria and Germany, collapsed under the threat, as France had done 3 years before. England was left an isolated defender of the sanctity of treaties and the law of nations. The Teutonic triumph was complete, but it was a victory gained at a perilous cost. France, after her treatment in 1905, had begun a thorough military reorganization. Now, Russia, in 1910, made an enormous increase in her already vast army, and both Russia and France, smarting under similar experiences, closed their ranks, cemented their alliance, and set to work to construct with Russian labor and French money the new strategic railway systems of which Russia's western frontier stood in need. It was next the turn of Great Britain to feel the pressure of German power. In the spring of 1909, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Mr. McKenna, suddenly demanded the construction of no less than 6 dreadnought battleships. He based this claim on the rapid growth of the German fleet and its expansion and acceleration under the new naval law of 1908, which was causing the Admiralty the greatest anxiety. I was still a skeptic about the danger of the European situation, and not convinced by the Admiralty case. In conjunction with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I proceeded at once to canvass this scheme and to examine the reasons by which it was supported. The conclusions which we both reached were that a program of 4 ships would sufficiently meet our needs. In this process, I was led to analyze minutely the character and composition of the British and German navies, actual and prospective. I could not agree with the Admiralty contention that a dangerous situation would be reached in the year 1912. I found the Admiralty figures on this subject were exaggerated. I did not believe that the Germans were building dreadnoughts secretly in excess of their published fleet laws. I held that our margin in pre-dreadnought ships would, added to a new program of 4 dreadnoughts, assure us an adequate superiority in 1912, quote, the danger year, as it was then called. In any case, as the Admiralty only claimed to lay down the 5th and 6th ships in the last month of the financial year, i.e. March 1910, these could not affect the calculations. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and I therefore proposed that 4 ships should be sanctioned for 1909 and that the additional 2 should be considered in relation to the program of 1910. Looking back on the voluminous papers of this controversy in light of what actually happened, there can be no doubt whatever that, so far as facts and figures were concerned, we were strictly right. The gloomy Admiralty anticipations were in no respect fulfilled in the year 1912. The British margin was found to be ample in that year. There were no secret German dreadnoughts, nor had Admiral von Tirpitz made any untrue statements in respect of major construction. The dispute in the cabinet gave rise to a fierce agitation outside. The process of the controversy led to a sharp rise of temperature. The actual points in dispute never came to an issue. Genuine alarm was excited throughout the country by what was for the first time widely recognized as a German menace. In the end, a curious and characteristic solution was reached. The Admiralty had demanded 6 ships. The economists offered 4, and we finally compromised on 8. However, 5 out of the 8 were not ready before the danger year of 1912 had passed peacefully away. But although the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I were right in the narrow sense, we were absolutely wrong in relation to the deep tides of destiny. The greatest credit is due to the First Lord of the Admiralty, Mr. McKenna, for the resolute and courageous manner in which he fought his case and withstood his party on this occasion. Little did I think, as this dispute proceeded, that when the next cabinet crisis about the Navy arose, our rules would be reversed, and little did he think that the ships for which he contended so stoutly would eventually, when they arrived, be welcomed with open arms by me. Whatever differences might be entertained about the exact number of ships required in a particular year, the British nation in general became conscious of the undoubted fact that Germany proposed to reinforce her unequaled army by a navy which in 1920 would be far stronger than anything up to the present possessed by Great Britain. To the Navy Law of 1900 had succeeded the amending measure of 1906, and upon the increases of 1906 had followed those of 1908. In a flamboyant speech at Naval in 1904, the German emperor had already styled himself, quote, the Admiral of the Atlantic. All sorts of sober-minded people in England began to be profoundly disquieted. What did Germany want this great navy for? Against whom, except us, could she measure it, match it, or use it? There was a deep and growing feeling, no longer confined to political and diplomatic circles, that the Prussians meant mischief, that they envied the splendor of the British Empire, and that if they saw a good chance at our expense, they would take full advantage of it. Moreover, it began to be realized that it was no use trying to turn Germany from her course by abstaining from countermeasures. Reluctance on our part to build ships was attributed in Germany to want of national spirit, and as another proof that the virile race should advance to replace the effete over-civilized and pacifist society which was no longer capable of sustaining its great place in the world's affairs. No one could run his eyes down the series of figures of British and German construction for the first 3 years of the Liberal administration without feeling in presence of a dangerous, if not a malignant, design. In 1905, Britain built 4 ships, and Germany 2. In 1906, Britain decreased her program to 3 ships, and Germany increased her program to 3 ships. In 1907, Britain further decreased her program to 2 ships, and Germany further increased her program to 4 ships. These figures are monumental. It was impossible to resist the conclusion, gradually forced on nearly everyone, that if the British Navy lagged behind, the gap would be very speedily filled. As president of the Board of Trade, I was able to obtain a general view of the structure of German finance. In 1909, a most careful report was prepared by my direction on the whole of this subject. Its study was not reassuring. I circulated it to the Cabinet with the following covering minute. November 3rd, 1909. Believing that there are practically no checks upon German naval expansion except those imposed by the increasing difficulties of getting money, I have had the enclosed report prepared with a view to showing how far these limitations are becoming effective. It is clear that they are becoming terribly effective. The overflowing expenditure of the German Empire strains and threatens every dike by which the social and political unity of Germany is maintained. The high customs duties have been largely rendered inelastic through commercial treaties and cannot meet the demand. The heavy duties upon foodstuffs, from which the main proportion of the customs revenue is raised, have produced a deep cleavage between the agrarians and the industrials, and the latter deem themselves quite uncompensated for the high price of foodstuffs by the most elaborate devices of protection for manufacturers. The splendid possession of the state railways is under pressure, being continually degraded to a mere instrument of taxation. The field of direct taxation is already largely occupied by state and local systems. The prospective inroad by the universal suffrage parliament of the empire upon this depleted field unites the propertied classes, whether imperialists or state right men, in a common apprehension with which the governing authorities are not unsympathetic. On the other hand, the new or increased taxation on every form of popular indulgence powerfully strengthens the parties of the left, who are themselves the opponents of expenditure on armaments and much else besides. Meanwhile, the German imperial debt has more than doubled in the last 13 years of unbroken peace, has risen since the foundation of the empire to about £220 million, has increased in the last 10 years by £105 million, and practically no attempt to reduce it has been made between 1880 and the present year. The effect of recurrent borrowings to meet ordinary annual expenditures has checked the beneficial process of foreign investment and dissipated the illusion, cherished during the South African War, that Berlin might supplant London as the lending center of the world. The credit of the German Empire has fallen to the level of that of Italy. It is unlikely that the new taxes which have been imposed with so much difficulty this year will meet the annual deficit. These circumstances force the conclusion that a period of severe internal strain approaches in Germany. Will the tension be relieved by moderation or snapped by calculated violence? Will the policy of the German government be to soothe the internal situation or to find an escape from it in external adventure? There can be no doubt that both courses are open. Low as the credit of Germany has fallen, her borrowing powers are practically unlimited. But one of the two courses must be taken soon, and from that point of view, it is of the greatest importance to gauge the spirit of the new administration from the outset. If it be pacific, it must soon become markedly pacific, and conversely. W.S.C. This is, I think, the first sinister impression that I was ever led to record. We have now seen how within the space of 5 years, Germany's policy and the growth of her armaments led her to arouse and alarm most profoundly 3 of the greatest powers in the world. 2 of them, France and Russia, had been forced to bow to the German will by the plain threat of war. Each had been quelled by the open intention of a neighbor to use force against them to the utmost limit without compunction. Both felt they had escaped a bloody ordeal and probable disaster only by submission. The sense of past humiliation was aggravated by the fear of future affronts. The third power, unorganized for war, but inaccessible and not to be neglected in the world's affairs, Britain, had also been made to feel that hands were being laid upon the very foundation of her existence. Swiftly, surely, methodically, a German navy was coming into being at our doors, which must expose us to dangers only to be warded off by strenuous exertions and by a vigilance almost as tense as that of actual war. As France and Russia increased their armies, so Britain, under the same pressure, increased her fleet. Henceforward the three disquieted nations will act more closely together and will not be taken by their adversary one by one. Henceforward their military arrangements will be gradually concerted. Henceforward they will consciously be facing a common danger. Ah, foolish, diligent Germans, working so hard, thinking so deeply, marching and countermarching on the parade grounds of the fatherland, poring over long calculations, fuming in newfound prosperity, discontented amid the splendor of mundane success, how many bulwarks to your peace and glory did you not, with your own hands, successively tear down? In the year 1909, writes von Bethmann-Hollweg, then the successor of Prince von Bülow, the situation was based on the fact that England had firmly taken its stand on the side of France and Russia in pursuit of its traditional policy of opposing whatever continental power for the time being was the strongest, and that Germany held fast to its naval program, had given a definite direction to its eastern policy, and had moreover to guard against a French antagonism that had in no wise been mitigated by its policy in later years. And if Germany saw a formidable aggravation of all the aggressive tendencies of Franco-Russian policy in England's pronounced friendship with this dual alliance, England, on its side, had grown to see a menace in the strengthening of the German fleet and a violation of its ancient rights in our eastern policy. Words had already passed on both sides. The atmosphere was chilly and clouded with distrust. Such, in his own words, was the inheritance of the new German Chancellor. He was now to make his own contribution to the anxieties of the world. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Part 1 of The World Crisis, Volume 1. The Crisis of Agadir, 1911. On the idle hill of summer, sleepy with the sound of streams, far I hear the steady drummer, drumming like a noise in dreams. Far and near and low and louder, on the roads of earth go by, dear to friends and food for powder, soldiers marching, all to die. The Shropshire Lad, 35. Agadir, the Panther, the alarm bells of Europe, Sir Edward Grey's warning, the period of silence, situation in the cabinet, decision of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, his Mansion House speech, the German rejoinder, naval precautions, effect of the Mansion House speech on German policy, British apprehensions of attack, the naval magazines, vulnerable points, the military situation, Sir Henry Wilson, a talk with the German ambassador, Count Metternich, the old diplomacy, meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defense, August 23rd, Sir Henry Wilson's forecast, Admiralty views, divergences between the generals and admirals, my memorandum of August 13th, the 20th day, the 40th day, plans for army expansion, continued anxiety, My letter to Sir Edward Grey, August 30th. End of the crisis. Consequences in Germany. The Prime Minister invites me to go to the Admiralty. The 9th chapter of Deuteronomy. In the spring of 1911, a French expedition occupied Fez. This action, added to the growing discontent in Germany over the Moroccan question, tempted the German government at the beginning of July to an abrupt act. The brothers Mannesmann, a German firm at that time very active in European financial circles, claimed that they had large interests in a harbor on the Atlantic seaboard of the Moroccan coast and in the hinterland behind it. This harbor bore the name of Agadir. Herr von Kitterlen-Wachter, the German foreign minister, raised this point with the French. The French government fully realized that the advantages they were gaining in Morocco justified Germany in seeking certain colonial compensations in the Congo area. The German press, on the other hand, was indignant at exchanging German interests in the moderate climate of Morocco for unhealthy tropical regions, of which they had already more than enough. The questions involved were complicated and intrinsically extremely unimportant. The French prepared themselves for a prolonged negotiation. So far as the harbor and hinterland of Agadir were concerned, there seemed to be no difficulty. They denied altogether the existence of any German interests there. They said there was only a sandy bay untouched by the hand of man. There was no German property on the shore, not a trading establishment, not a house. There were no German interests in the interior. But these facts could easily be ascertained by a visit of accredited representatives of both countries. Such a visit to ascertain the facts they professed themselves quite ready to arrange. They also courted a discussion of the frontier of the Congo territories. Suddenly and unexpectedly, on the morning of July 1st, without more ado, it was announced that His Imperial Majesty the German Emperor had sent his gunboat, the Panther, to Agadir to maintain and protect German interests. This small ship was already on its way. All the alarm bells throughout Europe began immediately to quiver. France found herself in the presence of an act which could not be explained, the purpose behind which could not be measured. Great Britain, having consulted the Atlas, began to wonder what bearing a German naval base on the Atlantic coast of Africa would have upon her maritime security. Observing, as the sailors say when they have to write official letters to each other, that such a fact must be taken in conjunction with German activities at Madeira and in the Canaries, and with the food routes and trade routes from South America and South Africa which converged and passed through these waters. Europe was uneasy. France was genuinely alarmed. When Count Metternich apprised Sir Edward Grey of the German action, he was informed that the situation was so important that it must be considered by the Cabinet. On July 5th, after the Cabinet, he was told that the British government could not disinterest themselves in Morocco, and that until Germany's intentions were made known, their attitude must remain one of reserve. From that date until July 21st, not one word was spoken by the German government. There is no doubt that the decided posture of Great Britain was a great surprise to the German Foreign Office. There ensued between the governments what was called at the time the period of silence. Meanwhile, the French and German newspapers carried on a lively controversy, and the British press wore a very somber air. It was difficult to divine from the long strings of telegrams which day after day flowed in from all the European chancelleries what was the real purpose behind the German action. I followed attentively the repeated discussions on the subject in the British cabinet. Was Germany looking for a pretext of war with France, or was she merely trying by pressure and uncertainty to improve her colonial position? In the latter case, the dispute would no doubt be adjusted after a period of tension, as so many had been before. The great powers marshaled on either side, preceded and protected by an elaborate cushion of diplomatic courtesies and formalities, would display to each other their respective arrays. In the forefront would be the two principal disputants, Germany and France, and echeloned back on either side at varying distances and under veils of reserves and qualifications of different density, would be drawn up the other parties to the Triple Alliance and to what was already now beginning to be called the Triple Entente. At the proper moment, these seconds or supporters would utter certain cryptic words indicative of their state of mind, as a consequence of which France or Germany would step back or forward a very small distance, or perhaps move slightly to the right or to the left. When these delicate rectifications in the great balance of Europe, and indeed of the world, had been made, the formidable assembly would withdraw to their own apartments with ceremony and salutations, and congratulate or condole with each other in whispers on the result. We had seen it several times before. But even this process was not free from danger. One must think of the intercourse of nations in those days not as if they were chessmen on the board, or puppets dressed in finery and frillings grimacing at each other in a quadrille, but as prodigious organizations of forces, active or latent, which, like planetary bodies, could not approach each other in space without giving rise to profound magnetic reactions. If they got too near, the lightnings would begin to flash, and beyond a certain point they might be attracted altogether from the orbits in which they were restrained and draw each other into dire collision. The task of diplomacy was to prevent such disasters, and as long as there was no conscious or subconscious purpose of war in the mind of any power or race, diplomacy would probably succeed. But in such grave and delicate conjunctions, one violent move by any party would rupture and derange the restraints upon all, and plunge cosmos into chaos. I thought myself that the Germans had a certain grievance about the original Anglo-French agreement. We had received many conveniences in Egypt. France had gained great advantages in Morocco. If Germany felt her relative position prejudiced by these arrangements, there was no reason why patiently and amicably she should not advance and press her own point of view. And it seemed to me that Britain, the most withdrawn, the least committed of the great powers, might exercise a mitigating and a modifying influence and procure an accommodation, and that, of course, was what we tried to do. But if Germany's intention were malignant, no such process would be of the slightest use. In that event, a very decided word would have to be spoken, and spoken before it was too late. Nor would our withdrawing altogether from the scene have helped matters. Had we done so, all our restraining influence would have vanished, and an intenser aggravation of the antagonistic forces must have occurred. Therefore, I read all the papers and telegrams which began to pass with a suspicion, and I could see beneath the calm of Sir Edward Grey a growing and at some moments a grave anxiety. The sultry obscurity of the European situation was complicated by the uncertain play of forces within our own council chamber. There again, in miniature, were reproduced the balances and reserves of the external diplomatic situation. The ministers who were conducting the foreign policy of Britain, with the ponderous trident of sea power towering up behind them, were drawn entirely from the liberal imperialist section of the government. They were narrowly watched and kept in equipoise by the radical element, which included the venerable figures of Lord Morley and Lord Loreburn, on whose side the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I had usually leaned. It was clear that this equipoise might easily make it impossible for Great Britain to speak with a decided voice either on one side or the other if certain dangerous conditions supervened. We should not, therefore, either keep clear ourselves by withdrawing from the danger, nor be able by resolute action to ward it off in time. In these circumstances, the attitude of the Chancellor of the Exchequer became of peculiar importance. For some weeks he offered no indication of what his line would be, and in our numerous conversations he gave me the impression of being sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other. But on the morning of July 21st, when I visited him before the cabinet, I found a different man. His mind was made up. He saw quite clearly the course to take. He knew what to do and how and when to do it. The tenor of his statement to me was that we were drifting into war. He dwelt on the oppressive silence of Germany so far as we were concerned. He pointed out that Germany was acting as if England did not count in the matter in any way, that she had completely ignored our strong representation, that she was proceeding to put the most severe pressure on France, that a catastrophe might ensue, and that if it was to be averted, we must speak with great decision, and we must speak at once. He told me that he was to address the bankers at their annual dinner that evening, and that he intended to make it clear that if Germany meant war, she would find Britain against her. He showed me what he had prepared, and told me that he would show it to the Prime Minister and Sir Edward Grey after the Cabinet. What would they say? I said that, of course, they would be very much relieved, and so they were, and so was I. The accession of Mr. Lloyd George in foreign policy to the opposite wing of the government was decisive. We were able immediately to pursue a firm and coherent policy. That night at the Bankers' Association, the Chancellor of the Exchequer used the following words: "I believe it is essential, in the highest interests not merely of this country, but of the world, that Britain should at all hazards maintain her place and her prestige amongst the great powers of the world. Her potent influence has many a time been in the past, and may yet be in the future, invaluable to the cause of human liberty. It has more than once in the past redeemed continental nations, who are sometimes too apt to forget that service, from overwhelming disaster and even from national extinction. I would make great sacrifices to preserve peace. I conceive that nothing would justify a disturbance of international goodwill except questions of the gravest national moment. But if a situation were to be forced upon us, in which peace could only be preserved by the surrender of the great and beneficent position Britain has won by centuries of heroism and achievement, by allowing Britain to be treated where her interests were vitally affected as if she were of no account in the cabinet of nations, then I say emphatically that peace at that price would be a humiliation intolerable for a great country like ours to endure." His city audience, whose minds were obsessed with the iniquities of the Lloyd George budget and the fearful hardships it had inflicted upon property and wealth, little did they dream of the future, did not comprehend in any way the significance or the importance of what they heard. They took it as if it had been one of the ordinary platitudes of ministerial pronouncements upon foreign affairs. But the chancelleries of Europe bounded together. 4 days later, at about 5:30 in the afternoon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I were walking by the fountains of Buckingham Palace. Hot foot on our track came a messenger. "Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer go at once to Sir Edward Grey?" Mr. Lloyd George stopped abruptly and, turning to me, said, "That's my speech. The Germans may demand my resignation as they did Delcos's." I said, "That will make you the most popular man in England." He was not actually the most popular at that time. We returned as fast as we could and found Sir Edward Grey in his room at the House of Commons. His first words were, "I have just received a communication from the German ambassador so stiff that the fleet might be attacked at any moment. I have sent for McKenna to warn him." He then told us briefly of the conversation he had just had with Count Metternich. The ambassador had said that after the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, no explanation could be made by Germany. In acrid terms, he had stated that if France should repel the hand offered her by the Emperor's government, the dignity of Germany would compel her to secure by all means full respect by France for German treaty rights. He had then read a long complaint about Mr. Lloyd George's speech, which, to say the least, could have been interpreted as a warning to Germany's address, and which, as a matter of fact, had been interpreted by the presses of Great Britain and France as a warning bordering on menace. Sir Edward Grey had thought it right to reply that the tone of the communication which had just been read to him rendered it inconsistent with the dignity of His Majesty's government to give explanations with regard to the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The First Lord arrived while we were talking, and a few minutes later hurried off to send the warning orders. They sound so very cautious and correct, these deadly words. Soft, quiet voices purring, courteous, grave, exactly measured phrases in large, peaceful rooms. But with less warning, cannons had opened fire and nations had been struck down by this same Germany. So now, the Admiralty wireless whispers through the ether to the tall masts of ships, and the captains pace their decks absorbed in thought. It is nothing. It is less than nothing. It is too foolish, too fantastic to be thought of in the 20th century. Or is it fire and murder leaping out of the darkness at our throats, torpedoes ripping the bellies of half-awakened ships, a sunrise on a vanished naval supremacy, and an island well guarded hitherto, at last defenseless? No, it is nothing. No one would do such things. Civilization has climbed above such perils. The interdependence of nations in trade and traffic, the sense of public law, the Hague Convention, liberal principles, the Labor Party, high finance, Christian charity, common sense have rendered such nightmares impossible. Are you quite sure? It would be a pity to be wrong. Such a mistake could only be made once for all. The Mansion House speech was a surprise to all countries. It was a thunderclap to the German government. All their information had led them to believe that Mr. Lloyd George would head the peace party and that British action would be neutralized. Jumping from one extreme to another, they now assumed that the British cabinet was absolutely united and that the Chancellor of the Exchequer of all others had been deliberately selected as the most radical minister by the British government to make this pronouncement. They could not understand how their representatives and agents in Great Britain could have been so profoundly misled. Their vexation proved fatal to Count Metternich, and at the first convenient opportunity he was recalled. Here was an ambassador who, after 10 years' residence in London, could not even forecast the action of one of the most powerful ministers on a question of this character. It will be seen from what has been written that this view was hard on Count Metternich. How could he know what Mr. Lloyd George was going to do? Until a few hours before, his colleagues did not know. Working with him in close association, I did not know. No one knew. Until his mind was definitely made up, he did not know himself. It seems probable now that the Germans did not mean war on this occasion, but they meant to test the ground, and in so doing they were prepared to go to the very edge of the precipice. It is so easy to lose one's balance there. A touch, a gust of wind, a momentary dizziness, and all is precipitated into the abyss. But whether in the heart of the German state there was or was not a war purpose before England's part had been publicly declared, there was no such intention afterwards. After the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer and its sequel, the German government could not doubt that Great Britain would be against them if a war was forced upon France at this juncture. They did not immediately recede from their position, but they were most careful to avoid any fresh act of provocation, and all their further conduct of the negotiations with France tended to open in one direction or another paths of accommodation and of retreat. It remained extremely difficult for us to gauge the exact significance of the various points at issue, and throughout the months of July, August, and September the situation continued obscure and oppressive. The slight yet decisive change which came over the character of German diplomacy was scarcely perceptible, and at the same time certain precautionary military measures which were taken behind the German frontiers, so far as they were known to us, had the effect of greatly increasing our anxiety. In consequence, the atmosphere in England became constantly more heavily charged with electricity as one hot summer's day succeeded another. Hitherto, as Home Secretary, I had not had any special part to play in this affair, though I had followed it with the utmost attention as a member of the Cabinet. I was now to receive a rude shock. On the afternoon of July 27th, I attended a garden party at 10 Downing Street. There I met the Chief Commissioner of Police, Sir Edward Henry. We talked about the European situation, and I told him that it was serious. He then remarked that by an odd arrangement the Home Office was responsible through the Metropolitan Police for guarding the magazines at Chattenden and Lodge Hill in which all the reserves of naval cordite were stored. For many years these magazines had been protected without misadventure by a few constables. I asked what would happen if 20 determined Germans in 2 or 3 motor cars arrived well armed upon the scene one night. He said they would be able to do what they liked. I quitted the garden party. A few minutes later I was telephoning from my room in the Home Office to the Admiralty. Who was in charge? The First Lord was with the fleet at Cromarty. The First Sea Lord was inspecting. Both were, of course, quickly accessible by wireless or wire. In the meantime, an admiral, he shall be nameless, was in control. I demanded Marines at once to guard these magazines, vital to the Royal Navy. I knew there were plenty of Marines in the depots at Chatham and Portsmouth. The Admiral replied over the telephone that the Admiralty had no responsibility and had no intention of assuming any, and it was clear from his manner that he resented the intrusion of an alarmist civilian minister. You refuse, then, to send the Marines? After some hesitation, he replied, I refuse. I replaced the receiver and rang up the War Office. Mr. Haldane was there. I told him that I was reinforcing and arming the police that night and asked for a company of infantry for each magazine in addition. In a few minutes the orders were given. In a few hours the troops had moved. By the next day the cordite reserves of the Navy were safe. The incident was a small one, and perhaps my fears were unfounded, but once one had begun to view the situation in this light, it became impossible to think of anything else. All around flowed the busy life of peaceful and unsuspecting, easy-going Britain. The streets were thronged with men and women, utterly devoid of any sense of danger from abroad. For nearly 1,000 years, no foreign army had landed on British soil. For 100 years, the safety of the homeland had never been threatened. They went about their business, their sport, their class and party fights, year after year, generation after generation, in perfect confidence and considerable ignorance. All their ideas were derived from conditions of peace. All their arrangements were the result of long peace. Most of them would have been incredulous. Many would have been very angry if they had been told that we might be near a tremendous war, and that perhaps within this city of London, which harbored confidingly visitors from every land, resolute foreigners might be aiming a deadly blow at the strength of the one great weapon and shield in which we trusted. I began to make inquiries about vulnerable points. I found the far-seeing Captain Hankey, then Assistant Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defense, already on the move classifying them for the War Book, which project had actually been launched. I inquired further about sabotage and espionage and counter-espionage. I came in touch with other officers working very quietly and very earnestly, but in a small way and with small means. I was told about German spies and agents in the various British ports. Hitherto, the Home Secretary had to sign a warrant when it was necessary to examine any particular letter passing through the Royal Mails. I now signed general warrants authorizing the examination of all the correspondence of particular people upon a list to which additions were continually made. This soon disclosed a regular and extensive system of German-paid British agents. It was only in a very small part of the field of preparation that the Home Secretary had any official duty of interference, but once I got drawn in, it dominated all other interests in my mind. For 7 years I was to think of little else. Liberal politics, the people's budget, free trade, peace, retrenchment and reform, all the war cries of our election struggles, began to seem unreal in the presence of this new preoccupation. Only Ireland held her place among the grim realities which came one after another into view. No doubt other ministers had similar mental experiences. I'm telling my own tale. I now began to make an intensive study of the military position in Europe. I read everything with which I was supplied. I spent many hours in argument and discussion. The Secretary of State for War told his officers to tell me everything I wanted to know. The Chief of the General Staff, Sir William Nicholson, was an old friend of mine. I had served with him as a young officer on Sir William Lockhart's staff at the end of the Tirah expedition in 1898. He wrote fine, broad appreciations and preached a clear and steady doctrine. But the man from whom I learned most was the Director of Military Operations, General Wilson, afterwards Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. This officer had extraordinary vision and faith. He had acquired an immense and, I expect, an unequaled volume of knowledge about the continent. He knew the French army thoroughly. He was deeply in the secrets of the French General Staff. He had been head of the British Staff College. For years he had been laboring with one object, that if war came we should act immediately on the side of France. He was sure that war would come sooner or later. All the threads of military information were in his hands. The whole wall of his small room was covered by a gigantic map of Belgium, across which every practicable road by which the German armies could march for the invasion of France was painted clearly. All his holidays he spent examining these roads and the surrounding country. He could not do much in Germany. The Germans knew him too well. One night, the German ambassador, still Count Metternich, whom I had known for 10 years, asked me to dine with him. We were alone, and a famous hock from the Emperor's cellars was produced. We had a long talk about Germany and how she had grown great, about Napoleon and the part he had played in uniting her, about the Franco-German War and how it began and how it ended. I said what a pity it was that Bismarck had allowed himself to be forced by the soldiers into taking Lorraine, and how Alsace-Lorraine lay at the root of all the European armaments and rival combinations. He said these had been German provinces from remote antiquity until one day, in profound peace, Louis XIV had pranced over the frontier and seized them. I said their sympathies were French. He said they were mixed. I said that anyhow it kept the whole thing alive. France could never forget her lost provinces, and they never ceased to call to her. The conversation passed to a kindred but more critical subject. Was he anxious about the present situation? He said people were trying to ring Germany around and put her in a net, and that she was a strong animal to put in a net. I said, how could she be netted when she had an alliance with 2 other first-class powers, Austria-Hungary and Italy? We had often stood quite alone for years at a time without getting flustered. He said it was a very different business for an island, but when you had been marched through and pillaged and oppressed so often and had only the breasts of your soldiers to stand between you and invasion, it ate into your soul. I said that Germany was frightened of nobody, and that everybody was frightened of her. Then we came to the Navy. Surely, I said, it was a great mistake for Germany to try to rival Britain on the seas. She would never catch us up. We should build 2 to 1 or more if necessary, and at every stage antagonism would grow between the countries. Radicals and Tories, whatever they might say about each other, were all agreed on that. No British government which jeopardized our naval supremacy could live. He said Mr. Lloyd George had told him very much the same thing, but the Germans had no thought of naval supremacy. All they wanted was a fleet to protect their commerce and their colonies. I asked what was the use of having a weaker fleet. It was only another hostage to fortune. He said that the Emperor was profoundly attached to his fleet, and that it was his own creation. I could not resist saying that Moltke had pronounced a very different opinion of Germany's true interest. I have recorded these notes of a pleasant though careful conversation, not because they are of any importance, but because they help to show the different points of view. I learned afterwards that the Chancellor of the Exchequer in similar circumstances had spoken more explicitly, saying that he would raise 100 millions in a single year for the British Navy if its supremacy were really challenged. Count Metternich was a very honorable man, serving his master faithfully but laboring to preserve the peace, especially peace between England and Germany. I have heard that on one occasion at Berlin, in a throng of generals and princes, someone had said that the British fleet would one day make a surprise and unprovoked attack upon Germany, whereupon the ambassador had replied that he had lived in England for nearly 10 years, and he knew that such a thing was absolutely impossible. On this remark being received with obvious incredulity, he had drawn himself up and observed that he made it on the honor of a German officer, and that he would answer for its truth with his honor. This for a moment had quelled the company. End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Chapter 3, Part 2 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill, The Crisis of Agadir. It is customary for thoughtless people to jeer at the old diplomacy and to pretend that wars arise out of its secret machinations. When one looks at the petty subjects which have led to wars between great countries and to so many disputes, it is easy to be misled in this way. Of course, such small matters are only the symptoms of the dangerous disease, and are only important for that reason. Behind them lie the interests, the passions, and the destiny of mighty races of men, and long antagonisms express themselves in trifles. Great commotions, it was said of old, arise out of small things, but not concerning small things. The old diplomacy did its best to render harmless the small things. It could not do more. Nevertheless, a war postponed may be a war averted. Circumstances change, combinations change, new groupings arise, old interests are superseded by new. Many quarrels that might have led to war have been adjusted by the old diplomacy of Europe and have, in Lord Melbourne's phrase, blown over. If the nations of the world, while the sense of their awful experiences is still fresh upon them, are able to devise broader and deeper guarantees of peace and build their houses on a surer foundation of brotherhood and interdependence, they will still require the courtly manners, the polite and measured phrases, the imperturbable demeanor, the secrecy and discretion of the old diplomatists of Europe. This is, however, a digression. On August 23rd, after Parliament had risen and ministers had dispersed, the Prime Minister convened very secretly a special meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defense. He summoned the ministers specially concerned with the foreign situation and with the fighting services, including, of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There were also the principal officers of the Army and the Navy. I was invited to attend, though the Home Office was not directly concerned. We sat all day. In the morning the Army told its tale. In the afternoon, the Navy. General Wilson, as Director of Military Operations, stated the views of the General Staff. Standing by his enormous map, specially transported for the purpose, he unfolded, with what proved afterwards to be extreme accuracy, the German plan for attacking France in the event of a war between Germany and Austria on the one hand, and France and Russia on the other. It was briefly as follows. In the first place, the Germans would turn nearly 4/5 of their strength against France and leave only 1/5 to contain Russia. The German armies would draw up on a line from the Swiss frontier to Aix-la-Chapelle. They would then swing their right wing through Belgium, thus turning the line of fortresses by which the eastern frontiers of France were protected. This enormous swinging movement of the German right arm would require every road which led through Belgium from Luxembourg to the Belgian Meuse. There were 15 of these roads, and 3 divisions would probably march along each. The Belgian Meuse flowed parallel to the march of these divisions and protected their right flank. Along this river were three important fortified passages or bridgeheads. First, nearest Germany, Liege. The last, nearest France, Namur. And midway between the two, the fort of Huy. Now arose the question, would the Germans, after seizing these bridgeheads, confine themselves to the eastern side of the Belgian Meuse and use the river for their protection? Or would they be able to spare and bring a large body of troops to prolong their turning movement west of the Belgian Meuse and thus advance beyond it instead of inside it? This was the only part of their plan which could not be foreseen. Would they avoid the west side of the Belgian Meuse altogether? Would they skim along it with a cavalry force only? Or would they march infantry divisions or even army corps west of that river? When the time came, as we now know, they marched 2 whole armies. At that date, however, the most somber apprehension did not exceed 1, or at the outside 2, army corps. Overwhelming detailed evidence was adduced to show that the Germans had made every preparation for marching through Belgium. The great military camps in close proximity to the frontier, the enormous depots, the reticulation of railways, the endless sidings, revealed with the utmost clearness and beyond all doubt their design. Liege would be taken within a few hours of the declaration of war, possibly even before it, by a rush of motor cars and cyclists from the camp at Elsenborn. That camp was now, August 1911, crowded with troops, and inquisitive persons and ordinary country folk were already being roughly turned back and prevented from approaching it. What would Belgium do in the face of such an onslaught? Nothing could save Liege, but French troops might reach Namur in time to aid in its defense. For the rest, the Belgian army, assuming that Belgium resisted the invader, would withdraw into the great entrenched camp and fortress of Antwerp. This extensive area, intersected by a tangle of rivers and canals and defended by 3 circles of forts, would become the last refuge of the Belgian monarchy and people. The position of Holland was also examined. It was not thought that the Germans would overrun Holland as they would Belgium, but they might find it very convenient to march across the curiously shaped projection of Holland which lay between Germany and Belgium, and which in the British General Staff parlance of that time was called the Maastricht Appendix. They would certainly do this if any considerable body of their troops was thrown west of the Belgian Meuse. The French plans for meeting this formidable situation were not told in detail to us, but it was clear that they hoped to forestall and rupture the German enveloping movement by a counteroffensive of their own on the greatest scale. The number of divisions available on both sides and on all fronts when mobilization was completed were estimated as follows: French, 85; German, 110. It was asserted that if the 6 British divisions were sent to take position on the extreme French left immediately war was declared, the chances of repulsing the Germans in the first great shock of battle were favorable. Every French soldier would fight with double the confidence if he knew that he was not fighting alone. Upon the strength of Russia, General Wilson spoke with great foresight, and the account which he gave of the slow mobilization of the Russian army swept away many illusions. It seemed incredible that Germany should be content to leave scarcely a score of divisions to make head against the might of Russia. But the British General Staff considered that such a decision would be well-founded. We shall see presently how the loyalty of Russia and of the Tsar found the means by prodigious sacrifices to call back to the east vital portions of the German army at the supreme moment. Such action could not be foreseen then, and most people have forgotten it now. There was, of course, a considerable discussion and much questioning before we adjourned at 2 o'clock. When we began again at 3, it was the turn of the Admiralty, and the First Sea Lord, Sir Arthur Wilson, with another map expounded his views of the policy we should pursue in the event of our being involved in such a war. He did not reveal the Admiralty war plans. Those he kept locked away in his own brain, but he indicated that they embodied the principle of a close blockade of the enemy's ports. It was very soon apparent that a profound difference existed between the War Office and the Admiralty view. In the main, the Admiralty thought that we should confine our efforts to the sea, that if our small army were sent to the continent, it would be swallowed up among the immense hosts conflicting there, whereas if we kept in ships or ready to embark for counterstrokes upon the German coast, it would draw off more than its own weight of numbers from the German fighting line. This view, which was violently combated by the generals, did not commend itself to the bulk of those present, and on many points of detail connected with the landings of these troops, the military and naval authorities were found in complete discord. The serious disagreement between the military and naval staffs in such critical times upon fundamental issues was the immediate cause of my going to the Admiralty. After the council had separated, Mr. Haldane intimated to the Prime Minister that he would not continue to be responsible for the War Office unless a Board of Admiralty was called into being which would work in full harmony with the War Office plans and would begin the organization of a proper naval war staff. Of course, I knew nothing of this, but it was destined soon to affect my fortunes in a definite manner. I thought that the General Staff took too sanguine a view of the French army. Knowing their partisanship for France, I feared the wish was father to the thought. It was inevitable that British military men, ardently desirous of seeing their country intervene on the side of France, and convinced that the destruction of France by Germany would imperil the whole future of Great Britain, should be inclined to overrate the relative power of the French army and accord it brighter prospects than were actually justified. The bulk of their information was derived from French sources. The French General Staff were resolute and hopeful. The principle of the offensive was the foundation of their military art and the mainspring of the French soldier. Although, according to the best information, the French pre-war army, when fully mobilized, was only 3/4 as strong as the German pre-war army, the French mobilization from the 9th to the 13th day yielded a superior strength on the fighting front. High hopes were entertained by the French generals that a daring seizure of the initiative and a vigorous offensive into Alsace-Lorraine would have the effect of rupturing the carefully thought-out German plans of marching through Belgium on to Paris. These hopes were reflected in the British General Staff appreciations. I could not share them. I had therefore prepared a memorandum for the Committee of Imperial Defense, which embodied my own conclusions upon all I had learned from the General Staff. It was dated August 13th, 1911. It was, of course, only an attempt to pierce the veil of the future, to conjure up in the mind a vast imaginary situation, to balance the incalculable, to weigh the imponderable. It will be seen that I named the 20th day of mobilization as the date by which the French armies will have been driven from the line of the Meuse and will be falling back on Paris and the south, and the 40th day as that by which Germany should be extended at full strain both internally and on her war fronts, and that opportunities for the decisive trial of strength may then occur. I am quite free to admit that these were not intended to be precise dates, but as guides to show what would probably happen. In fact, however, both these forecasts were almost literally verified 3 years later by the event. I reprinted this memorandum on the 2nd of September, 1914, in order to encourage my colleagues with the hope that if the unfavorable prediction about the 20th day had been borne out, so also would be the favorable prediction about the 40th day. And so indeed it was. Military Aspects of the Continental Problem. Memorandum by Mr. Churchill. August 13th, 1911. The following notes have been written on the assumption that a decision has been arrived at to employ a British military force on the continent of Europe. It does not prejudge that decision in any way. It is assumed that an alliance exists between Great Britain, France, and Russia, and that these powers are attacked by Germany and Austria. 1. The decisive military operations will be those between France and Germany. The German army is at least equal in quality to the French and mobilizes 2.2 million against 1.7 million. The French must therefore seek for a situation of more equality. This can be found either before the full strength of the Germans has been brought to bear or after the German army has become extended. The first might be reached between the 9th and 13th days, the latter about the 40th. 2. The fact that during a few days in the mobilization period the French are equal or temporarily superior on the frontiers is of no significance, except on the assumption that France contemplates adopting a strategic offensive. The Germans will not choose the days when they themselves have least superiority for a general advance, and if the French advance, they lose at once all the advantages of their own internal communications, and by moving towards the advancing German reinforcements, annul any numerical advantage they may for the moment possess. The French have, therefore, at the beginning of the war, no option but to remain on the defensive, both upon their own fortress line and behind the Belgian frontier, and the choice of the day when the first main collision will commence rests with the Germans, who must be credited with the wisdom of choosing the best possible day and cannot be forced into decisive action against their will, except by some reckless and unjustifiable movement on the part of the French. 3. A prudent survey of chances from the British point of view ought to contemplate that, when the German advance decisively begins, it will be backed by sufficient preponderance of force and developed on a sufficiently wide front to compel the French armies to retreat from their positions behind the Belgian frontier, even though they may hold the gaps between the fortresses on the Verdun-Belfort front. No doubt a series of great battles will have been fought with varying local fortunes, and there's always a possibility of a heavy German check. But even if the Germans were brought to a standstill, French would not be strong enough to advance in their turn, and in any case we ought not to count on this. The balance of probability is that by the 20th day, the French armies will have been driven from the line of the Meuse and will be falling back on Paris and the south. All plans based upon the opposite assumption ask too much of fortune. 4. This is not to exclude the plan of using 4 or 6 British divisions in these great initial operations. Such a force is a material factor of significance. Its value to the French would be out of all proportion to its numerical strength. It would encourage every French soldier and make the task of the Germans enforcing the frontier much more costly. But the question which is of most practical consequence to us is, what is to happen after the frontier has been forced and the invasion of France has begun? France will not be able to end the war successfully by any action on the frontiers. She will not be strong enough to invade Germany. Her only chance is to conquer Germany in France. It is this problem which should be studied before any final decision is taken. 5. The German armies in advancing through Belgium and onwards into France will be relatively weakened by all or any of the following causes. By the greater losses incidental to the offensive, especially if they have tested unsuccessfully the French fortress lines. By the greater employment of soldiers necessitated by acting on exterior lines. By having to guard their communications through Belgium and France, especially from the sea flank. By having to invest Paris, requiring at least 500,000 men against 100,000, and to besiege or mask other places, especially along the seaboard. By the arrival of the British Army. By the growing pressure of Russia from the 30th day. And generally by the bad strategic situation to which their right-handed advance will commit them as it becomes pronounced. All these factors will operate increasingly in proportion as the German advance continues and every day that passes. 6. Time is also required for the naval blockade to make itself felt on German commerce, industry, and food prices, as described in the Admiralty Memorandum, and for these again to react on German credit and finances already burdened with the prodigious daily costs of the war. All these pressures will develop simultaneously and progressively. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has drawn special attention to this and to the very light structure of German industry and economic organizations. 7. By the 40th day, Germany should be extended at full strain both internally and on her war fronts, and this strain will become daily more severe and ultimately overwhelming unless it is relieved by decisive victories in France. If the French army has not been squandered by precipitate or desperate action, the balance of forces should be favorable after the 40th day, and will improve steadily as time passes. For the German armies will be confronted with a situation which combines an ever-growing need for a successful offensive with a battlefront which tends continually towards numerical equality. Opportunities for the decisive trial of strength may then occur. 8. Such a policy demands heavy and hard sacrifices from France, who must, with great constancy, expose herself to invasion, to having her provinces occupied by the enemy, and to the investment of Paris, and whose armies may be committed to retrograde or defensive operations. Whether her rulers could contemplate or her soldiers endure this trial may depend upon the military support which Great Britain can give, and this must be known beforehand so that the French war plans can be adjusted accordingly and so that we may know, before we decide, what they would be prepared to do. 9. The following measures would appear to be required to enable Great Britain to take an effective part in the decisive theater of the war. Men, approximate. The 4 divisions of the Expeditionary Army, with their auxiliary troops, should be sent on the outbreak of war to France, 107,000. To these should be added the 2 remaining divisions as soon as the naval blockade is effectively established, 53,000. And the 7th Division from South Africa and the Mediterranean, as soon as the colonial forces in South Africa can be embodied, 15,000. And 5,000 additional yeomanry cavalry or light horse, with 10,000 volunteer cyclist territorials, 15,000. As we should be allies of Russia, the Anglo-Indian Army could be drawn upon so long as 2 native regiments were moved out of India for every British regiment. Lord Kitchener has stated that it would be possible in so grave a need to withdraw 6 out of the 9 field divisions from India, and this should be done immediately. This force could be brought into France by Marseilles by the 40th day, 100,000, thus making a total force of 290,000. This fine army, almost entirely composed of professional soldiers, could be assembled around, say, Tours by the 40th day, in rear of the French left, instead of being frittered into action piecemeal, and would then become a very important factor in events. The Russian army would also by then be engaged in full force on the eastern frontiers of Germany and Austria, and the powers of the 3 allies should then be sufficient either to hold the Germans in a position of growing difficulty or, if desirable, to assume the offensive in concert. 10. To provide meanwhile for the security of Great Britain, for unforeseeable contingencies, and for sustaining the Expeditionary Army with a continuous supply of volunteer drafts, it would be necessary on the outbreak, A. To embody the whole territorial force, B. To call for volunteers for home defense from all persons possessing military experience, C. To raise a compulsory levy of 500,000 men for home defense. This levy should be formed upon the cadres of the territorial divisions, so as to enable a proportion of the territorial army to be released at the end of the 6th month. The question of sending any part of the compulsory levy by compulsion to the continent would not arise until after this force had been trained. The steady augmentation of British military strength during the progress of the war would, however, put us in a position by the end of the 12th month to secure or reestablish British interests outside Europe, even if, through the defeat or desertion of allies, we were forced to continue the war alone. No lesser steps would seem adequate to the scale of events. W.S.C. The conference separated. Apprehension lay heavy on the minds of all who had participated in it. The War Office hummed with secrets in those days. Not the slightest overt action could be taken, but every preparation by forethought was made and every detail was worked out on paper. The railway timetables, or graphics as they were called, of the movement of every battalion, even where they were to drink their coffee, were prepared and settled. Thousands of maps of northern France and Belgium were printed. Cavalry maneuvers were postponed on account of the scarcity of water in Wiltshire and the neighboring counties. The press, fiercely divided on party lines, overwhelmingly pacific in tendency, without censorship, without compulsion, observed a steady universal reticence. Not a word broke the long-drawn oppressive silence. The great railway strike came to an end with mysterious suddenness. Mutual concessions were made by masters and men after hearing a confidential statement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. In the middle of August, I went to the country for a few days. I could not think of anything else but the peril of the war. I did my other work as it came along, but there was only one field of interest fiercely illuminated in my mind. Sitting on a hilltop in the smiling country which stretches around Mells, the lines I have copied at the top of this chapter kept running through my mind. Whenever I recall them, they bring back to me the anxieties of those Agadir days. From Mells, I wrote the following letter to Sir Edward Grey. It speaks for itself. Mr. Churchill to Sir Edward Grey, 30th of August, 1911. Perhaps the time is coming when decisive action will be necessary. Please consider the following policy for use if and when the Morocco negotiations fail. Propose to France and Russia a triple alliance to safeguard, inter alia, the independence of Belgium, Holland, and Denmark. Tell Belgium that, if her neutrality is violated, we are prepared to come to her aid and to make an alliance with France and Russia to guarantee her independence. Tell her that we will take whatever military steps will be most effective for that purpose, but the Belgian army must take the field in concert with the British and French armies, and Belgium must immediately garrison properly Liège and Namur. Otherwise, we cannot be responsible for her fate. Offer the same guarantee both to Holland and to Denmark, contingent upon their making their utmost exertions. We should, if necessary, aid Belgium to defend Antwerp and defeat that fortress and any army based on it. We should be prepared at the proper moment to put extreme pressure on the Dutch to keep the Scheldt open for all purposes. If the Dutch close the Scheldt, we should retaliate by a blockade of the Rhine. It is very important to us to be able to blockade the Rhine, and it gets more important as the war goes on. On the other hand, if the Germans do not use the Maastricht Appendix in the first days of the war, they will not want it at all. Let me add that I am not at all convinced about the wisdom of a close blockade, and I did not like the Admiralty statement. If the French send cruisers to Mogador and Safi, I am of the opinion that we should, for our part, move our main fleet to the north of Scotland into its war station. Our interests are European and not Moroccan. The significance of the movement would be just as great as if we sent our 2 ships with the French. Please let me know when you will be in London, and will you kindly send this letter on to the Prime Minister. My views underwent no change in the 3 years of peace that followed. On the contrary, they were confirmed and amplified by everything I learned. In some respects, as in the abolition of the plan of close blockade and the sending of the fleet to its war station, I was able to carry them out. In other cases, such as the defense of Antwerp, I had not the power to do in time what I believe to be equally necessary. But I tried my best, not, as has frequently been proclaimed, upon a foolish impulse, but in pursuance of convictions reached by pondering and study. I could not help feeling a strong confidence in the truth of these convictions when I saw how several of them were justified one after the other in that terrible and unparalleled period of convulsion. I had no doubts whatever what ought to be done in certain matters, and my only difficulty was to persuade or induce others. The Agadir crisis came, however, peacefully to an end. It had terminated in the diplomatic rebuff of Germany. Once more, she had disturbed all Europe by a sudden and menacing gesture. Once more, she had used the harshest threats towards France. For the first time, she had made British statesmen feel that sense of direct contact with the war peril which was never absent from continental minds. The French, however, offered concessions and compensations. An intricate negotiation about the frontiers of French and German territory in West Africa, in which the bec de canard played an important part, had resulted in an agreement between the two principals. To us, it seemed that France had won a considerable advantage. She was not, however, particularly pleased. Her Prime Minister, M. Callot, who had presided during those anxious days, was dismissed from office on grounds which at the time it was very difficult to appreciate here, but which viewed in the light of subsequent events can more easily be understood. The tension in German governing circles must have been very great. The German colonial secretary, von Lindquist, resigned rather than sign the agreement. There is no doubt that deep and violent passions of humiliation and resentment were coursing beneath the glittering uniforms which thronged the palaces through which the Kaiser moved. And of those passions, the Crown Prince made himself the exponent. The world has heaped unbounded execrations upon this unlucky being. He was probably in fact no better and no worse than the average young cavalry subaltern who had not been through the ordinary mill at public school, nor had to think about earning his living. He had a considerable personal charm, which he lavished principally upon the fair sex, but which in darker days has captivated the juvenile population of Wieringen. His flattered head was turned by the burning eyes and guttural words of the great captains and statesmen and party leaders. He therefore threw himself forward into this strong favoring current and became a power, or rather the focus of a power, with which the Kaiser was forced to reckon. Germany once more proceeded to increase her armaments by land and sea. It was a question, writes von Tirpitz, of our keeping our nerve, continuing to arm on a grand scale, avoiding all provocation, and waiting without anxiety until our sea power was established and forced the English to let us breathe in peace. Only to breathe in peace. What fearful apparatus was required to secure this simple act of respiration? Early in October, Mr. Asquith invited me to stay with him in Scotland. The day after I had arrived there, on our way home from the links, he asked me quite abruptly whether I would like to go to the Admiralty. He had put the same question to me when he first became Prime Minister. This time, I had no doubt what to answer. All my mind was full of the dangers of war. I accepted with alacrity. I said, "Indeed I would." He said that Mr. Haldane was coming to see him the next day, and we would talk it over together. But I saw that his mind was made up. The fading light of evening disclosed in the far distance the silhouettes of two battleships steaming slowly out of the Firth of Forth. They seemed invested with a new significance to me. That night, when I went to bed, I saw a large Bible lying on a table in my bedroom. My mind was dominated by the news I had received of the complete change in my station and of the task entrusted to me. I thought of the peril of Britain, peace-loving, unthinking, little prepared, of her power and virtue, and of her mission of good sense and fair play. I thought of mighty Germany, towering up in the splendor of her imperial state, and delving down in her profound, cold, patient, ruthless calculations. I thought of the Army Corps I had watched tramp past, wave after wave of valiant manhood at the Breslau maneuvers in 1907, of the thousands of strong horses dragging cannon and great howitzers up the ridges and along the roads around Würzburg in 1910. I thought of German education and thoroughness and all that their triumphs in science and philosophy implied. I thought of the sudden and successful wars by which her power had been set up. I opened the book at random, and in the 9th chapter of Deuteronomy I read, "Hear, O Israel, thou art to pass over Jordan this day, to go in to possess nations greater and mightier than thyself, cities great and fenced up to heaven, a people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, whom thou knowest, and of whom thou hast heard say, who can stand before the children of Anak? Understand therefore this day, that the Lord thy God is he which goeth over before thee. As a consuming fire he shall destroy them, and he shall bring them down before thy face. So shalt thou drive them out, and destroy them quickly, as the Lord hath said unto thee. Speak not thou in thine heart, after that the Lord thy God hath cast them out from before thee, saying, For my righteousness the Lord hath brought me in to possess this land. For the wickedness of these nations the Lord doth drive them out from before thee. Not for thy righteousness, or for the uprightness of thine heart, dost thou go to possess their land. But for the wickedness of these nations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." It seemed a message full of reassurance. End of chapter 3, part 2.